The slap came so suddenly I couldn't even react. For a moment, the conference room fell into absolute silence. 15 people sat frozen, not one stood up. Not a single word of defense. My face burned where his hand had struck. But the sting of their silence cut deeper. They all just sat there, averting their eyes, pretending nothing had happened. But 30 minutes later, I walked back through those doors, not with tears, but with his worst nightmare. And this time, the silence would be his. My name is Claire Monroe, and I've spent the last 3 years as a senior financial analyst at Dizion Technologies, one of Denver's most prestigious tech corporations. At 34, I'd built my career on precision, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, qualities that would ultimately put me in the crosshairs of the most powerful man in our company. The quarterly review meeting had started like any other. 20 executives gathered around the polished mahogany table in the 32nd floor conference room, the Denver skyline stretching endlessly behind floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat halfway down the table, my laptop open to the financial projections I'd been analyzing for weeks. Something wasn't right with the numbers. I'd discovered discrepancies that suggested systematic inflation of our revenue streams. Phantom transactions that made our quarterly performance look 30% better than reality. When my turn came to present, I stood, my voice steady despite the gravity of what I was about to reveal. Before we proceed with the regional expansions, there's a critical issue with our Q3 reporting that needs immediate attention. I clicked to the slide showing the altered figures, highlighting the ghost transactions in red. These numbers have been manipulated. We're looking at potential securities fraud if we file these with the SEC. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gerald Knox, our executive vice president and the second most powerful person in the company, slowly rose from his chair at the head of the table. At 58, Gerald commanded rooms with his silver hair and $1,000 suits. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something far more sinister. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "are you suggesting that this leadership team would knowingly falsify financial records?" I met his gaze directly. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Knox. I'm stating facts. These transactions don't exist. The trail leads to dummy accounts that—" The slap came without warning. His palm connected with my left cheek with such force that I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the edge of the table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. My laptop clattered to the floor. For a moment, I couldn't process what had happened. The burning sensation spread across my face as I straightened, my hand instinctively rising to my cheek. The silence that followed was deafening. 20 pairs of eyes, including our HR director, Margaret Walsh, who'd always preached about our zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence, suddenly found fascinating things to study on their phones, their notebooks, the table's wood grain. Our CFO, Thomas Bryant, who'd mentored me since I joined the company, turned his chair slightly away. Not one person stood up. Not one voice protested. They all just sat there, complicit in their silence, while Gerald returned to his seat as if he'd done nothing more than swat a fly. "This meeting is about growth strategies," Gerald said calmly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Not baseless accusations from junior staff who don't understand the complexities of corporate finance. Perhaps, Miss Monroe, you should take the rest of the day to reconsider your position here." My ears rang. My cheek throbbed. But more than the physical pain, it was the suffocating weight of their collective cowardice that threatened to break me. These people, some I'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, celebrated promotions with, they all chose their comfort over basic human decency. I bent down slowly, deliberately, and picked up my laptop. My hands didn't shake as I closed it and gathered my papers. I looked around the room one more time, memorizing each averted face, each person who'd chosen complicity over courage. Margaret Walsh was studying her manicure. Thomas Bryant was typing intently on his phone. The others maintained their practiced blindness. "I'll be taking your advice, Mr. Knox," I said, my voice carrying a steel I didn't know I possessed. I'll be reconsidering everything. I walked to the door with my head high, my heels clicking against the marble floor in steady rhythm. As I reached for the handle, I turned back one final time. Gerald was already moving on, pulling up the next presentation as if he hadn't just committed assault in front of 20 witnesses. 30 minutes, I said quietly, though everyone heard me. Give me 30 minutes. Gerald laughed, actually laughed. Threats? Miss Monroe? That's beneath you. I didn't respond. I simply walked out, leaving them to their willful blindness. They had no idea what they'd just witnessed wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of Gerald Knox's complete and utter destruction. And every single one of them who sat in silence would remember this moment when their world came crashing down. The moment the elevator doors closed, I pulled out my phone with steady hands. My cheek still burned, but the fury coursing through my veins burned hotter. I had one call to make, one that would change everything. I scrolled to the contact simply labeled Mom and pressed dial. Claire, sweetheart, I'm in the middle of... Mom, I said, my voice controlled, but urgent. Gerald Knox just hit me, in front of 20 witnesses, in the executive conference room. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. When Diane Monroe spoke again, her voice had transformed from maternal warmth to something far more dangerous. The voice that had made her one of the most feared investigators at the Federal Workforce Integrity Bureau. Are you hurt? I'm fine. But Mom, they all saw it. HR, the CFO, everyone. No one said a word. Stay exactly where you are. Don't go to your office. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mom, I told them 30. Then I'll be there in 25. And Claire, start recording everything on your phone, every interaction from this moment forward. The line went dead. I stood in the lobby, watching the normal flow of corporate life continue around me. People grabbing coffee, chatting about weekend plans, oblivious to the storm about to hit their company. The security guard, Marcus, noticed my face and started to approach, concern in his eyes, but I waved him off. 23 minutes later, I saw the black federal sedan pull up outside. Diane Monroe didn't walk into buildings, she invaded them. At 59, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years dismantling corporate corruption. Her steel gray suit was impeccable, her badge prominently displayed, and her expression could have frozen hell itself. 2 younger agents flanked her, their faces equally stern. Conference room, 32nd floor, I said quietly as she approached. She nodded, then looked at my face, her jaw tightening at what must have been visible redness. Agent Vargas, photograph everything. Agent Kim, I want this building's security footage from the last 2 hours sealed as federal evidence. We rode the elevator in silence. I could feel the energy radiating from my mother, controlled, focused, lethal. When we reached the 32nd floor, she turned to me. You follow behind me. Don't speak unless I ask you a direct question. Understood? I nodded. She pushed open the conference room doors without knocking. The reaction was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Gerald, who'd been mid-presentation at the smartboard, turned with irritation that quickly morphed into something resembling fear. This is a private meeting, he began. Gerald Knox. My mother's voice cut through the room like a blade. I'm Director Diane Monroe, Federal Workforce Integrity Bureau. This conference room is now under federal investigation for assault, workplace violence, and potential witness intimidation. She held up her badge, letting it catch the light. Nobody moves, nobody leaves, everyone remains exactly where you are. Margaret Walsh, our HR director, finally found her voice. Director Monroe, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Diane said, her voice arctic, is your apparent belief that federal law doesn't apply in this room. Agent Vargas, begin documenting everyone present, names, titles, and exact seating positions. I stepped out from behind my mother, and the room's collective intake of breath was audible. Gerald's face had drained of color, his usual commanding presence crumbling as he realized the connection. This is a conflict of interest," he stammered. "You can't investigate this. My relationship to the victim is precisely why I can investigate this." Diane interrupted. "The FWIB has broad jurisdiction over workplace violence, especially when it involves executive leadership and potential systemic cover-ups. But if you'd prefer, Mr. Knox, I can refer this to the FBI's white-collar crime division. They're particularly interested in companies that falsify financial records, something I believe was being discussed when you assaulted my daughter." The last two words hung in the air like a death sentence. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Thomas Bryant's face had gone pale. "Now," Diane continued, pulling out a digital recorder. "Let's start with something simple. Mr. Knox, did you strike Claire Monroe during this meeting?" Gerald's lawyer instincts kicked in. "I want my attorney present before." "That's your right. But while we wait, everyone else will be providing their witness statements. Agent Kim, start with..." She consulted her notes. "Margaret Walsh, Human Resources Director. Ma'am, you witnessed an assault in your workplace. What actions did you take?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. We were all shocked. It happened so fast." "So you took no action, made no report, offered no assistance to the victim. Is that correct?" The room was suffocating in its silence. 20 executives who commanded millions in salaries, who made decisions affecting thousands of employees, reduced to frightened children caught in their shameful act. I stood beside my mother, my face still bearing the mark of Gerald's hand, watching as their carefully constructed world began to crack. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. This was about to become an investigation into every dirty secret, every covered-up transgression, every moment of willful blindness that had led to this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diane announced, "you have two choices. Cooperate fully with this investigation or explain to a federal judge why you chose to remain silent when witnessing a violent assault. Agent Vargas will now take individual statements. I suggest you consider very carefully what you're about to say. Lying to a federal investigator carries a 5-year prison sentence." Gerald's hand shook as he reached for his phone, undoubtedly to call his lawyer. But I saw something else in his eyes now, real fear. He'd just realized that hitting me wasn't his biggest mistake. His biggest mistake was doing it in front of witnesses while I had Diane Monroe for a mother. The 30 minutes I'd promised were up, and his nightmare had officially begun. What Gerald Knox and the others didn't know was that his slap hadn't surprised me. It had simply accelerated my timeline. For the past 18 months, I'd been methodically documenting every instance of corruption, abuse, and malfeasance at Disian Technologies. The assault was just the final piece of a much larger puzzle I'd been assembling in the shadows. It started innocently enough. A discrepancy in overtime payments that didn't add up. A female colleague crying in the bathroom after a performance review with Gerald. Contracts awarded to vendors who happened to be golf buddies with board members. Each incident alone might have been dismissed as corporate politics. But together, they painted a picture of systematic rot that went straight to the top. My home office had become a war room. Behind a false panel in my closet lay 18 months of evidence. 3 external hard drives with backed-up emails, including ones from Gerald's deleted folder that our IT department thought were gone forever. It helped that I dated a cybersecurity expert who taught me that nothing digital ever truly disappears. You just need to know where to look. The audio recordings were perfectly legal. Colorado is a one-party consent state, meaning I could record any conversation I was part of. I had Gerald on tape making explicitly discriminatory comments about female employees, calling them emotional liabilities and diversity checkboxes. I had him bragging about forcing out a whistleblower by making their life professionally unbearable. Most damning. I had him instructing the accounting team to massage the numbers for investor calls. But it wasn't just Gerald. The entire leadership structure was compromised. Thomas Bryant, my supposed mentor, had been skimming from the employee pension fund. Small amounts, barely noticeable, but consistent over years. Margaret Walsh in HR had a folder labeled Problems to Solve that contained files on employees who'd complained about harassment or discrimination. None of those employees still worked at Dician. I'd photographed documents during late nights at the office when everyone thought I was just another workaholic analyst. The security cameras had blind spots. I'd mapped them all. The janitor, Roberto, had become an inadvertent ally, always warning me when executives were working late, thinking he was just being friendly to the nice lady who always asked about his grandchildren. The crown jewel of my collection was a series of screenshots from Gerald's computer. During a company party 6 months ago, he'd left his laptop unlocked in his office. While everyone was drinking champagne in the conference room, I'd spent 15 minutes with my phone camera, documenting his private emails to board members about Project Clean Sweep, a plan to lay off 300 employees while simultaneously giving executive bonuses totaling $12 million. The kicker? They planned to blame the layoffs on market conditions while the company was posting record profits. I had employment contracts showing massive disparities in compensation. Men in identical roles to women were making 40% more on average. But Gerald was smart. The titles were slightly different, just enough to claim they weren't the same position. Director of Strategic Initiatives versus Director of Strategic Planning. Same job, different pay. Plausible deniability. The sexual harassment was harder to document, but impossible to ignore. Gerald had a type. Young, ambitious women who couldn't afford to lose their jobs. I'd found 3 former employees willing to speak off the record about their experiences. Melissa, his former assistant, had been the bravest. She'd actually recorded one of his propositions on her phone, his voice clear as day. Your performance review depends on how well you perform for me, if you understand my meaning. Then there were the financial crimes, falsified reports to investors, backdated contracts, a shell company in Delaware that existed solely to funnel money from client projects into executive bonuses. I'd traced the money trail through public records and corporate filings, creating a flowchart that would make any federal prosecutor salivate. I'd even documented the small cruelties, the way Gerald would schedule mandatory meetings during religious holidays for certain employees, how he'd accidentally leave people off important emails to undermine them, the psychological warfare he waged against anyone who challenged him. Every piece of evidence was backed up in 3 locations: a safety deposit box at a bank across town, an encrypted cloud server, and a USB drive I'd given to my best friend with instructions to release everything if anything happened to me. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. The slap in the conference room wasn't a moment of lost control. It was Gerald being Gerald, finally showing his true face in front of witnesses. He'd gotten so comfortable in his power, so confident in everyone's complicity, that he'd forgotten the most basic rule: leave no evidence. But I hadn't forgotten. For 18 months, I'd been building a case that would destroy not just Gerald, but the entire corrupt ecosystem that enabled him. The physical assault was just the match that would light the fuse. The real explosion would come when federal investigators started digging into what I'd already unearthed. As I stood in that conference room watching Agent Vargas question witnesses, I thought about the USB drive in my pocket containing everything, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that would turn this from a simple assault case into a RICO investigation. Gerald thought he'd put me in my place with that slap. In reality, he'd just signed his own death warrant, and unlike him, I'd been careful. Every piece of evidence was legally obtained, every recording lawfully made, every document legitimately accessed during my normal job duties. I'd built an airtight case, and now I had federal investigators ready to receive it. The 18 months of patience, of silent observation, of careful documentation, it had all led to this moment. Gerald Knox thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The wall of silence lasted exactly 47 hours. That's how long it took for the first crack to appear. And when it did, the entire structure came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. It started with an encrypted message on Signal from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Melissa. I heard what happened. I'm ready to talk. Officially this time. Melissa Hartley, Gerald's former assistant who'd left the company 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Within an hour of responding to her message, my phone began buzzing with notifications from others who'd suffered in silence. The group text I'd sent to select former employees had been simple. Gerald Knox assaulted me in front of 20 witnesses yesterday. The Federal Workplace Integrity Bureau is now investigating. If you've been waiting for the right moment to speak up, this is it. By that evening, I was coordinating with 7 former employees who wanted to file formal complaints. Each story was a variation on the same theme: Gerald's abuse of power, the HR department's complicity, and the suffocating culture of fear that kept everyone quiet. Marcus Chen, a former software engineer, called me directly. He grabbed me by the throat once, he said, his voice shaking even 2 years after the incident. Said I was making him look bad by correcting his technical errors in a client meeting. HR said it was a personality conflict and offered me a severance package with an NDA. I needed the money for my mom's cancer treatment, so I signed. The current employees were more cautious but equally angry. They created anonymous email accounts, sharing their experiences through encrypted messages. The facilities manager revealed that Gerald had a hidden camera in his office, not for security, but to record private conversations with employees he wanted to intimidate later. The head of legal compliance admitted she'd been ordered to destroy documentation of safety violations at our Denver plant. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Williams from accounting reached out through my mother's office. She'd been in that conference room, one of the 20 silent witnesses, and the guilt was eating her alive. I have everything, she told me when we met at a coffee shop in Boulder, far from any potential dissonant eyes. Her hands shook as she slid a flash drive across the table. 3 years of cooked books, 2 sets of accounting records, one for the SEC, one for reality. Gerald doesn't know I kept copies. Why didn't you come forward before? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I have 2 kids in college. My husband has MS. I couldn't afford to lose this job. Tears ran down her face. But watching him hit you, seeing everyone just sit there, I went home and couldn't look my daughter in the eye. She's your age. What if someone did that to her and everyone just watched? The flash drive contained financial crimes that made my discoveries look like parking violations. Embezzlement, tax fraud, investor fraud. Gerald and his inner circle had stolen nearly $30 million over 5 years. They'd hidden it through a complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies, but Sarah had documented every transaction. Meanwhile, the official investigation was creating its own pressure. Federal agents had set up a temporary office in our building, interviewing every employee who'd been in that meeting. The cracks in their stories were becoming chasms. Margaret from HR claimed she didn't see anything clearly, but Thomas Bryant had already stated she was looking directly at Gerald when it happened. 2 board members swore Gerald had merely gestured emphatically, while 3 others admitted he'd struck me. Gerald made a critical error on day 2. He sent a company-wide email about maintaining loyalty during external investigations and reminded everyone about their NDAs. My mother's team immediately flagged this as witness tampering. Then he tried to access the security footage from that day, not knowing the federal agents had already seized it. Another charge: attempted destruction of evidence. The younger employees were the first to break ranks publicly. A group of junior analysts published an open letter on LinkedIn detailing the toxic culture at Dizzion. Within hours, it had 3,000 shares and caught the attention of TechCrunch and the Denver Post. Former employees began adding their stories in the comments, a cascade of testimonies about discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. James Rodriguez, who'd been fired 6 months earlier for performance issues after reporting safety violations, posted a detailed timeline of Gerald's retaliations against whistleblowers. Amanda Foster revealed she'd been demoted after refusing Gerald's advances at a company retreat. David Kim shared recordings of meetings where Gerald used racial slurs when discussing diversity initiatives. The wall of silence hadn't just cracked, it had shattered completely. What started as 20 people protecting Gerald through their silence had become hundreds speaking out against him. The very culture of fear he'd cultivated to protect himself had created a powder keg of resentment. And my mother's investigation had lit the match. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. Arthur Llewellyn, a former board member who'd resigned suddenly last year, reached out to my mother's office. He had recordings of board meetings where Gerald explicitly discussed targeting employees who didn't fit the culture, code for women, minorities, and anyone who questioned his authority. "I'm 73 years old," Arthur told the investigators. "I've been a coward for too long." That young woman had more courage in that conference room than I've had in my entire career. It's time to do the right thing. The silence that had protected Gerald Knox for years was now the very thing destroying him. Each person who came forward encouraged others to do the same. The investigators were overwhelmed with the volume of complaints and evidence pouring in. What had started as an assault investigation was morphing into something much larger, a complete dismantling of a corrupt corporate empire. And through it all, Gerald remained in his office, watching his kingdom crumble, still believing his money and connections would save him. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come. On day 4 of the investigation, Dizzian Technologies made the catastrophic mistake that would seal their fate. At 9:47 a.m., I received an email from Margaret Walsh, our illustrious HR director, officially notifying me of my immediate suspension, pending investigation into workplace disruption and insubordination. The reasons cited: creating a hostile work environment through baseless accusations against senior leadership. I actually laughed when I read it. Then I forwarded it directly to my mother and the federal investigation team. Within an hour, Agent Vargas was in Margaret's office with a new set of charges: illegal retaliation against a federal witness. Margaret's face, according to the assistant who overheard through the thin walls, went from confident to corpse-pale in seconds. She'd just handed the federal prosecutors a gift-wrapped felony. But Gerald wasn't done digging his grave. That afternoon, security escorted me from the building, while I was meeting with federal investigators in the conference room they'd commandeered. The optics were spectacular. Armed security guards attempting to remove a federal witness from an active investigation scene. Agent Kim stepped between me and the security team, his hand resting on his badge. "Gentlemen, you're interfering with a federal investigation. I suggest you reconsider." The security guards, who were just following orders, looked helplessly between Agent Kim and their radios, crackling with Gerald's increasingly frantic demands. They chose wisely and retreated. The suspension letter had triggered something called the Adverse Action Provision under federal whistleblower laws. By retaliating against me while I was cooperating with a federal investigation, Dizzian had just multiplied their potential penalties by 10. My mother called it corporate suicide by stupidity. That evening, Gerald made his second fatal error. Our IT department detected unusual activity on the company servers. Someone was attempting to mass delete emails and financial records. The digital forensics team my mother had stationed in the building caught it in real time. They traced it back to Gerald's personal laptop, using his executive credentials, attempting to wipe 5 years of data: obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, conspiracy to defraud federal investigators. The charges were stacking up like floors in a skyscraper. But the universe wasn't done serving poetic justice. Caleb Morrison, our former head of IT who'd been fired last year for budget reasons, reached out with a bombshell. He'd maintained a backup server that Gerald didn't know about, a complete mirror of all company data updated daily until his termination. "Gerald had me build it after a ransomware scare," Caleb explained when he met with investigators. He wanted a secret backup that only he could access. What he didn't know was that I kept my own access credentials. I had a feeling something like this might happen someday. Caleb's server contained everything Gerald thought he'd deleted over the past year. Every incriminating email, every doctored financial record, every communication about illegal terminations. He'd even captured Gerald's attempts to sell company secrets to competitors while publicly denying any corporate espionage. The third mistake came from the board of directors. In their panic, They hired an external crisis management firm to handle the narrative. That firm's first action? Reaching out to current employees with media training sessions that were actually coaching them on how to minimize Gerald's assault and discredit me. One brave intern recorded the entire session on her phone and sent it to the Denver Post. The headline the next morning was devastating. Dicion Technologies coaches employees to lie to federal investigators. The story included audio of the crisis manager explicitly telling employees to describe the assault as a misunderstanding and to paint me as a disgruntled employee with an agenda. The Colorado Attorney General's office joined the investigation. The SEC launched their own probe. The Department of Labor opened a case. What had started as one woman standing up to her abuser was becoming a multi-agency takedown of corporate corruption. Inside Dicion, chaos reigned. Employees were choosing sides, and Gerald's side was shrinking by the hour. His longtime allies were distancing themselves, suddenly remembering urgent business trips or family emergencies. The CFO, Thomas Bryant, hired his own legal counsel and stopped coming to the office. 3 board members resigned via email, citing philosophical differences with current leadership. Margaret Walsh made a desperate attempt to save herself by claiming she'd been forced to suspend me under duress from Gerald. She provided investigators with text messages from him demanding my termination, thinking this would exonerate her. Instead, it added conspiracy charges to her growing list of legal problems. The security footage from my suspension attempt was leaked to social media. The image of federal agents protecting me while corporate security tried to remove me went viral. Dicion assault began trending. Former employees from Dicion offices in other cities started sharing their own Gerald Knox horror stories. By day 5, Gerald had barricaded himself in his executive suite, refusing to speak to anyone except his team of lawyers, now numbering 6 and growing. He'd stopped pretending everything was fine. The man who'd slapped me with such casual arrogance was now watching his empire collapse in real time, and every attempt to save himself only accelerated his downfall. The suspension letter that was meant to silence me had become Exhibit A in a federal case that now included witness tampering, retaliation, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Gerald had thought he was punishing me for speaking up. Instead, he'd handed prosecutors the rope they'd use to hang him. But even then, in his desperation and delusion, Gerald Knox still believed his money and influence would save him. He had no idea that the real avalanche was just beginning, and that memo suspending me would go down in corporate legal history as one of the stupidest retaliatory moves ever made during a federal investigation. The Denver Post broke the story on a Tuesday morning with a headline that made my phone explode with notifications. Federal investigation reveals decades of systematic abuse at Denver tech giant. The investigative journalist, Rebecca Torres, had spent 3 days connecting dots that painted a devastating picture of Gerald Knox's reign of terror. The article was meticulous. Torres had interviewed 17 former employees, analyzed 5 years of public financial filings, and obtained internal documents that showed a pattern of discrimination, financial fraud, and systematic retaliation. She'd even found 3 lawsuits that had been settled out of court and buried under NDAs, until those NDAs were voided by the federal investigation. By noon, the story had been picked up by TechCrunch, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. CNBC ran a segment titled The Toxic King of Denver Tech, featuring my pixelated image from the security footage, standing firm while surrounded by security guards. The footage became the visual symbol of corporate corruption versus individual courage. Dicion's stock price plummeted 18% in 3 hours. Trading was halted twice. 3 major clients, including a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company, announced they were reviewing their partnerships with Dicion. Corporate speak for "We're out." The Denver Chamber of Commerce quietly removed Gerald from their board of directors. Social media transformed into a digital courthouse. The hashtag Gerald Knox assault had evolved into Dicion survivors, with former employees sharing their stories. A software engineer posted about being forced to work through her miscarriage because Gerald didn't believe in female problems. A sales director revealed he'd been demoted after his husband attended a company event. The stories kept coming, each one adding another crack to Gerald's already shattered reputation. Then came the interview that changed everything. Melissa Hartley, Gerald's former assistant, went on local news with her attorney. She was done being silent. With cameras rolling, she played the audio recording of Gerald propositioning her, his voice clear and unmistakable. "Your career here depends on how grateful you can be for my mentorship. I prefer gratitude that's physical." The interviewer asked her why she'd stayed quiet for so long. Melissa's answer was heartbreaking. "He told me no one would believe a nobody assistant over a CEO. He said he'd make sure I never worked in tech again. And for 2 years, I believed him. But seeing Claire stand up to him, seeing her refuse to be silenced, she gave me my voice back." Within hours, Melissa's courage inspired others. 3 more women came forward with similar recordings. Gerald's attorney released a statement calling the accusations fabricated and the recordings taken out of context. But the damage was catastrophic. The Denver district attorney announced they were opening a criminal investigation into sexual assault charges. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. According to a source who leaked to Bloomberg, it was chaos. Half the board wanted Gerald gone immediately. The other half worried about litigation and severance packages. While they debated, more revelations emerged. An anonymous whistleblower released internal emails showing the board knew about Gerald's behavior for years and had actively covered it up to protect stock prices. Arthur Llewellyn, the former board member, gave an exclusive interview to the Financial Times. He revealed that Gerald had been nicknamed the Untouchable in board meetings, a reference to both his perceived invincibility and his inappropriate behavior. Arthur provided recordings of board meetings where members joked about Gerald's wandering hands and discussed strategies to manage his impulses rather than address them. The publicity triggered a domino effect. The Environmental Protection Agency announced an investigation into those safety violations at the Denver plant. The IRS opened an audit going back 7 years. The Colorado Department of Labor launched a probe into wage theft and discrimination. Every agency that had ever given Dishin a pass was now circling like sharks sensing blood. Our competitors smelled opportunity. Tech companies began actively recruiting Dizzion employees, offering signing bonuses and guaranteed positions. The brain drain was immediate and devastating. Entire teams resigned en masse. The AI development division, Dizion's crown jewel, lost 70% of its staff in 4 days. Gerald tried one last desperate move. He offered an interview to Fox Business, hoping to control the narrative. It was a disaster. He appeared haggard, unshaven, his usual commanding presence replaced by desperate deflection. When asked directly about hitting me, he stammered. It was a gesture of frustration that's been mischaracterized. The interviewer followed up. "Sir, are you saying you didn't strike Ms. Monroe?" Gerald's response, "I'm saying the situation has been blown out of proportion," became the most shared video clip of the week. By Friday, 1 week after the slap heard around the corporate world, Dizzion Technologies had lost 40% of its market value. $600 million in wealth had evaporated. Gerald Knox, once worth an estimated $200 million, was watching his empire crumble in real time. His name had become toxic, synonymous with corporate abuse and corruption. But the media storm was just setting the stage. The real reckoning would come in a federal courtroom, where no amount of PR spin or corporate lawyers could save Gerald Knox from the consequences of his actions. The court of public opinion had already convicted him. Now it was time for actual justice. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had never seen a crowd like this. On the morning of Gerald Knox's trial, 300 people gathered on the stone steps. Former employees, activists, reporters, and citizens who'd been following the case. Some held signs reading, "Justice for Corporate Abuse Victims," and "No More Silence." I walked through them with my head high, my mother beside me, ready to face the man who'd thought he could break me with a single slap. The courtroom was packed. Gerald sat at the defendant's table, flanked by four attorneys in suits that probably cost more than most people's cars. He'd lost weight. His former commanding presence diminished to a hollow shadow. When our eyes met, I didn't look away. He did. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Fitzgerald, laid out the charges with surgical precision: assault, creating a hostile work environment, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and destruction of federal evidence. Each charge carried significant prison time. Together, Gerald was looking at up to 20 years. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand with 18 months of preparation steadying my nerves. Fitzgerald started with the assault itself. Ms. Monroe, please tell the court what happened on September 15th in the Dizion Technologies conference room. I spoke clearly, every word deliberate. I was presenting evidence of financial irregularities when Mr. Knox stood up, walked over to me, and struck me across the face with his open hand. The force knocked me backward into the conference table. How many people witnessed this assault? 19 board members and executives, including our human resources director. And what did they do? Nothing. They sat in silence. Not one person spoke up or offered assistance. Gerald's lead attorney, Mitchell Carver, tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But every question he asked opened another door for me to present evidence. When he questioned my motives, I calmly described discovering millions in embezzled funds. When he suggested I'd misunderstood the financial records, I walked him through the fraud scheme with such precision that 2 jurors started taking notes. The security footage was played next. The courtroom watched in silence as Gerald's hand connected with my face, the sound echoing through the speakers. Several jurors winced. One woman put her hand to her own cheek. Gerald's attorneys had fought to keep the video out, claiming it was prejudicial. The judge had overruled them. It was direct evidence of the assault. Then came the parade of witnesses. Melissa Hartley took the stand, playing her recording of Gerald's proposition. Sarah Williams from accounting detailed the financial fraud, showing the jury the 2 sets of books. Marcus Chen described being choked, his voice breaking as he recounted his fear. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence surrounding Gerald. The most damaging witness was Arthur Llewellyn, the former board member. As a respected businessman with no personal stake in the outcome, his testimony carried enormous weight. He played recordings of board meetings where Gerald bragged about putting women in their place and described employees who complained as cancer cells to be removed. Mr. Llewellyn, Fitzgerald asked, why didn't you report this earlier? Arthur's voice was heavy with regret. I was a coward. I chose my comfort over my conscience. Watching Ms. Monroe stand up to him when 20 of us wouldn't, it shamed me into finally doing the right thing. Gerald's defense was pathetic. They claimed the slap was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress. They argued the financial irregularities were creative accounting that hadn't hurt anyone. They suggested the other testimonies were from disgruntled former employees with axes to grind. When Gerald himself took the stand, it was clear his attorneys had begged him not to. His arrogance, even diminished, couldn't help but surface. When asked about the assault, he said, I may have gestured too emphatically during a heated discussion. When Fitzgerald pressed him on whether he struck me, Gerald's response sealed his fate. She was being hysterical about numbers she didn't understand. Someone needed to restore order. The jury's faces told the story. They weren't looking at a powerful executive anymore. They were looking at a bully who'd finally met consequences. In his closing argument, Fitzgerald was brilliant. Gerald Knox believed he was untouchable. He created a kingdom of fear where he could assault, harass, and steal with impunity. But in America, no one is above the law. Not even CEOs who think their money and power put them beyond justice's reach. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back in, Gerald stood, still trying to project confidence. The foreman's voice was steady and clear. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of creating a hostile work environment, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of witness tampering, guilty. On the charge of destruction of federal evidence, guilty. With each guilty, Gerald seemed to shrink. His attorneys' faces were stone. In the gallery, Melissa Hartley was crying. Sarah Williams squeezed her hand. Former employees who'd suffered in silence for years finally had their vindication. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. But everyone knew Gerald Knox was going to federal prison. The man who'd ruled through fear, who'd believed his power made him invincible, was about to learn what it felt like to be truly powerless. As I walked out of the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. But I didn't stop. I'd said everything I needed to say on that witness stand. Gerald Knox had thought he could silence me with a slap. Instead, that slap had awakened a chorus of voices that brought down his empire and sent him to prison. Justice had been served, cold and deliberate, exactly as it should be. The sentencing day arrived with a cold February wind that seemed fitting for the occasion. Gerald Knox stood before Judge Patricia Thornton, a woman known for her intolerance of corporate criminals who thought their white collars made them special. Gerald's expensive suits couldn't hide what he'd become, a convicted felon about to learn his fate. Judge Thornton's voice filled the courtroom with quiet authority. Mr. Knox, you were entrusted with leadership, with the livelihoods of thousands of employees, with the faith of investors and partners. You betrayed every single one of those trusts. You created a culture of fear, abuse, and corruption that destroyed careers and lives. She looked directly at him. You've shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the harm you've caused. Even now, you see yourself as the victim. That ends today. Gerald Knox, I sentence you to 24 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company. You will pay restitution of $8 million to your victims. 24 months, 2 years. It wasn't the maximum sentence, but it was real prison time. Gerald's legs seemed to buckle slightly. His attorneys had promised him probation, maybe house arrest. Federal prison hadn't been in his calculations. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished with Dizzion Technologies. The company was ordered to pay $2.5 million in fines and accept federal oversight for 3 years. Every executive who'd been in that conference room was required to undergo mandatory training on workplace violence and their legal obligations as witnesses. Margaret Walsh and Thomas Bryant faced their own trials coming up. The entire HR department was dissolved and rebuilt under federal supervision. New policies were implemented requiring automatic law enforcement notification for any workplace violence. The company's board was restructured with mandatory independent directors. Dizzion Technologies would survive, but it would never be the same. As marshals prepared to take Gerald into custody, he turned to look at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, no recognition of what he'd done, just cold hatred for the woman who'd brought down his empire. I met his gaze steadily, unflinching. He was the one who looked away. They led him out in handcuffs, past the cameras, past the former employees who'd gathered to witness his fall. The man who'd once commanded conference rooms with his presence was now just another convicted felon heading to federal prison. His name would forever be associated with corporate abuse and the consequences of unchecked power. I walked out of the courthouse for the last time, my mother beside me. Reporters surrounded us, but I only made one brief statement. No one should have to endure workplace abuse in silence. No one is too powerful to face justice. Today's sentence sends a clear message. Assault is assault, whether it happens in a boardroom or on the street. I hope this encourages others to speak up, to stand firm, and to never accept violence as the price of employment. The next weeks brought a strange kind of closure. Melissa Hartley called to thank me, saying she'd finally started therapy and was healing. Sarah Williams got whistleblower protection and a new job at a firm that valued integrity. The other victims found their own paths forward, no longer carrying the weight of silent shame. As for me, I didn't return to Dizzion Technologies. I didn't need to. I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do. I started my own consulting firm, helping companies build ethical cultures and robust reporting systems. My first client was a tech startup whose young CEO had followed the case and wanted to ensure nothing like that could ever happen at her company. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded from my attorney. It was from Gerald Knox, writing from federal prison. I expected threats, rage, maybe even a lawsuit threat. Instead, it was 3 sentences. You were right about the numbers. The fraud went deeper than you knew. I'm sure you're satisfied. I burned the letter without responding. Gerald Knox didn't deserve my words, my anger, or my forgiveness. He was serving his time, facing the consequences of his choices. The man who'd thought he could silence me with violence had learned that some voices refused to be silenced. A year after the trial, the Denver Business Journal ran a feature story, "The Slap That Changed Corporate Culture." It detailed how companies across Colorado had implemented new workplace violence policies, how HR departments were being restructured with actual independence, how boards were taking their oversight responsibilities seriously. Gerald's assault had become a watershed moment, a cautionary tale taught in business schools and corporate training sessions. I rarely think about Gerald Knox anymore. When I do, it's not with anger or satisfaction, it's with a cold certainty that justice, while sometimes slow, eventually arrives for those who believe they're above it. He took 2 years of his life to plan and execute his crimes. He got 2 years in prison to think about them. The last I heard, Gerald was released after serving 18 months with good behavior. He lives quietly somewhere in Florida, his fortune decimated by legal fees and restitution, his reputation destroyed, his name toxic in every boardroom in America. He's free, but he'll never be powerful again. And me? I'm still here, still standing, still speaking truth to power. Because that's what you do when someone tries to silence you with violence. You speak louder, clearer, and with the full force of justice behind you. Gerald Knox thought he could break me with a single slap. Instead, he taught me that my voice was more powerful than his fist would ever be. And that voice helped bring down an empire built on fear, sending its king to a federal prison cell where titles mean nothing and power is just a memory. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice, served cold and impartial, delivered by a system that declares no one, absolutely no one, is untouchable. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful narratives like this one. And I'm curious, what would you have done in Claire's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means everything. And remember, your voice matters. Never let anyone silence it.